The copper ceiling glowed like molten gold in the firelight, casting warmth across every corner of the 30-foot cabin while a blizzard raged outside. Augustin Mercier stood at the far end, 30 feet from the stone fireplace, without a shiver, while his neighbor, Baptiste Fournier, pressed against his own dying fire just 200 yards away, frost forming on the walls behind him. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale might just change how you see the world. The winter of 1843 arrived early in Montana Territory, bringing temperatures that dropped so low that spit froze before hitting the ground. Baptiste Fournier learned this firsthand as he stood outside Augustin Mercier's cabin on a January afternoon, trying to understand what he was seeing. Smoke rose from Augustin's chimney in a thin, lazy column, not the thick black plume that came from a fire being fed constantly to fight the cold. Just a moderate stream that suggested a normal fire, the kind you'd burn on a cool autumn evening, not during a blizzard that had already killed 2 men at the trading post 15 miles south. Baptiste had come to check on Augustin, assuming his neighbor would need help. The temperature had been below zero for 6 straight days. Most cabins in the territory had become desperate places where families huddled within arm's reach of roaring fires, abandoning the far corners of their homes to the killing cold. Baptiste's own cabin was miserable. He kept a fire burning so hot that the stones of his fireplace had cracked, yet the far end of his living space had frost forming on the interior walls. His wife and children slept pressed together on pallets dragged close to the hearth, and still they shivered through the nights. He knocked on Augustin's door expecting to find similar conditions. What he found instead made no sense. Augustin opened the door wearing a simple wool shirt, no coat, no furs. Behind him the cabin interior glowed with a warmth Baptiste could feel from the doorway. But what struck Baptiste silent was the sight of Augustin's daughter playing on the floor at the far end of the cabin, 30 feet from the fireplace, wearing nothing but a light dress, completely comfortable. Baptiste stepped inside and closed the door. The warmth enveloped him immediately, but it was different from the oppressive heat near his own fireplace. This was even distributed, almost gentle. He walked toward the far end where the child played, expecting the temperature to drop with each step. It didn't. 30 feet from the fire, the air remained remarkably warm. He looked back at the fireplace. A moderate fire, nothing excessive. The mystery deepened. His eyes traveled upward, and he saw it. The ceiling. Copper sheets fitted together in overlapping panels, covering the entire interior surface above their heads. The metal caught the firelight and threw it back in rippling patterns of amber and gold. The surface gleamed as though recently polished. Baptiste had heard rumors about Mercier's ceiling, heard the jokes and mockery that had followed its construction 5 years earlier. He had participated in that mockery, called it Mercier's copper folly, laughed at the waste of money and effort. He wasn't laughing now. He stood in the warm far end of the cabin, feeling heat that should not exist, and understood that Augustin Mercier had solved a problem that was currently freezing families across the territory. Augustin Mercier had not always been a man obsessed with heat. In the autumn of 1836, he was simply another trapper trying to build a life in Montana Territory. He had arrived 3 years earlier from Quebec with his wife Celeste and enough money to establish a trap line along the tributary creeks that fed into the Yellowstone River. They built their cabin in a sheltered valley where cottonwoods provided timber and the surrounding hills broke the worst of the winter winds. The cabin they constructed was typical of the era. 30 feet long to provide adequate living space, 12 feet wide, with a single stone fireplace at the eastern end. Augustin had built it carefully, selecting straight logs and fitting them with reasonable precision. The chinking was good, a mixture of clay and moss that sealed most gaps. The roof was solid, layered bark and sod that kept out rain and snow. By the standards of frontier construction, it was a sound structure. Celeste had been pleased with it, and they spent their first winter there in relative comfort. But that first winter had been mild. The second winter tested them more severely, and Augustin noticed a problem. When the temperature dropped below zero, the far western end of the cabin became uncomfortably cold. He compensated by building larger fires, burning more wood, keeping the flames high. It worked adequately. The western end remained cool, but not dangerously so. Celeste complained occasionally about the chill when she worked at the table positioned away from the fireplace, but she managed by wearing extra layers. The winter of 1837 was different. It began early and struck hard. By mid-November, temperatures had plunged to levels Augustin had never experienced. He burned fires constantly, massive fires that consumed wood at an alarming rate. The area near the fireplace became almost unbearably hot. The far end remained dangerously cold. Augustin moved their sleeping pallets closer to the hearth. Celeste stopped using the western end of the cabin entirely. They effectively abandoned a third of their living space. On December 9, 1837, the temperature dropped to what local trappers would later estimate was 40 below zero. The sky was clear, the stars brilliant, and the cold was absolute. Augustin kept the fire roaring through the night, feeding it constantly. He and Celeste slept close to the flames, wrapped in every fur and blanket they owned. Sometime after midnight, Celeste woke complaining of severe chills despite being near the fire. She was shaking uncontrollably. Augustin piled more furs on her, built the fire even higher, but her shaking intensified. By dawn, Celeste was unconscious. By midday, she was dead. The temperature near the fireplace had been warm enough to make Augustin sweat. 30 feet away, frost covered the interior walls. The cold had somehow reached her anyway, or perhaps the extreme temperature variation had shocked her system beyond recovery. The specific mechanism didn't matter. What mattered was that their cabin, despite its roaring fire, had killed his wife. Augustin buried Celeste on a hillside above their cabin 3 days after she died. The ground was frozen solid, and it took him 2 full days to chip out a grave using a pickaxe and iron bar heated repeatedly in his fireplace. He wrapped her body in their best blankets and marked the spot with stones he had carried from the creek. He stood at the grave for an hour after filling it, not praying exactly, but thinking about heat and cold and the failure of his construction. He returned to the cabin and immediately began measuring. He had no formal instruments, but he improvised. He filled identical tin cups with water heated to the same temperature and placed them at intervals along the cabin's length. He timed how long each took to cool. The results were stark. Water placed 5 feet from the fireplace stayed hot for over an hour. Water placed 30 feet from the fireplace cooled to room temperature in less than 20 minutes. The temperature gradient was severe and obvious. Augustin spent the next week conducting experiments that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. He burned different types of wood and measured the heat distribution. He tried building fires in different configurations. He attempted to create barriers and channels to direct the heat toward the cabin's far end. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Heat rose from the fire, concentrated near the ceiling above the fireplace, and dissipated into the roof structure. Very little heat traveled horizontally across the length of the cabin. He began examining other cabins in the area. Most trappers built structures between 20 and 30 feet long. In every case, the same pattern held. The area near the fireplace was comfortable. The far end was significantly colder. Most men accepted this as inevitable, a simple fact of cabin life. They dealt with it by staying near the fire, wearing heavy clothing indoors, or building secondary fires at the opposite end if they had the wood and labor to manage 2 hearths. Augustin became convinced there had to be a better solution. The problem was engineering, not fate. Heat was a physical phenomenon that followed rules. If those rules could be understood, they could be manipulated. He had no formal education in physics or thermodynamics. His schooling had ended at age 12, but he understood basic principles from experience. Hot air rises, cold air sinks, heat travels from warm objects to cool objects. These were observable facts. The question that obsessed him was simple. How could heat be moved horizontally instead of vertically? How could the warmth rising from his fireplace be redirected across the length of his cabin instead of escaping uselessly into the roof? He lay awake at night thinking about it. He sketched crude diagrams on birch bark using charcoal. He talked through the problem aloud to himself, working through possibilities and rejecting them one by one. By January 1838, 2 months after Celeste's death, Augustin had stopped trapping entirely. His trapline sat unchecked. His income stopped. He spent every day thinking about heat distribution, studying his cabin, and searching for an answer that continued to elude him. In late January, Augustin traveled to the trading post at the confluence of 2 major creeks, a settlement that served the scattered trapping community. He needed supplies and had to sell the furs he had processed before abandoning his trapline. The trading post was a rough collection of log structures centered around a main store operated by a French-Canadian named Levesque. The settlement included a dozen permanent residents and served perhaps 50 trappers who worked the surrounding territory. Augustin completed his business at the store and found himself with time before beginning the return journey. He wandered through the settlement, eventually stopping at the blacksmith's forge. The smithy was a 3-sided shelter open to the south, with a stone forge at the center and an impressive collection of tools hanging from the walls. The blacksmith was a Norwegian named Christofferson, who had come west after working in iron mills in Pennsylvania. He was shoeing a horse when Augustin arrived, and the 2 men nodded greetings but didn't speak. Augustin watched the work with half his attention while his mind continued working on his heat problem. The forge burned hot, fed by a bellows that Christofferson pumped with his foot while he worked. The heat radiating from the coals was intense. Augustin could feel it from 10 feet away. But what caught his attention was something else. Christofferson had hung a curved sheet of iron behind the forge, positioned to reflect heat back toward his work area. The sheet was scorched and discolored from exposure, but its purpose was obvious. It was directing heat that would otherwise be lost to the open south side of the shelter back toward the workspace. Augustin studied the setup more carefully. The iron sheet was positioned at a slight angle, not vertical. The curve was subtle but deliberate. Heat rising from the forge struck the metal surface and bounced forward and downward, creating a warm zone in front of the forge that was noticeably warmer than the surrounding air. Christofferson worked in this reflected heat, using it to keep himself comfortable while working with cold metal. The observation planted something in Augustin's mind. Metal reflected heat, not just light, but thermal radiation. He had known this abstractly, had observed it in cooking pots and metal surfaces near fires, but had never considered it as a solution to his problem. He asked Christofferson about the iron sheet. The blacksmith explained that he had installed it 2 years earlier after getting tired of freezing while working in winter. The south-facing opening was necessary for ventilation, but it meant losing heat. The iron sheet recovered some of that heat and made the workspace bearable. Augustin asked technical questions. What type of metal worked best? Did the surface need to be polished, or could it be rough? Did the angle matter? Christofferson answered what he could, but admitted he had built the reflector through trial and error, not scientific understanding. Polished metal seemed to work better than rough surfaces. The angle mattered, but he couldn't explain exactly why. He just knew from experience that a curved, angled surface directed heat more effectively than a flat vertical sheet. Augustin left the trading post with his mind racing. Augustin returned to his cabin with a new obsession layered onto his existing fixation. Metal reflected heat. The principle was demonstrable, but how could it be applied to a 30-foot cabin? He couldn't hang a metal sheet behind his fireplace like Christofferson had done at the forge. His fireplace was built into the cabin wall, and reflecting heat back toward it would accomplish nothing. He needed to redirect heat outward, across the length of his living space, not back toward its source. He spent February conducting crude experiments. He salvaged a copper pot that had developed a leak, cut it open, and flattened the metal into a rough sheet. He positioned it at various angles above his fireplace, trying to determine if heat could be bounced horizontally. The results were inconclusive. The metal sheet was too small to capture significant heat, and his placement methods were too imprecise to draw reliable conclusions, but he convinced himself that the basic principle could work if properly implemented. In early March, a traveling metallurgist named Severin Beaumont arrived at the trading post. Beaumont was an educated Frenchman who had worked in European foundries before coming to America to consult on mining operations in the Western Territories. He was passing through on his way to a silver prospect in Idaho and stopped at the trading post to resupply. Word of his presence spread quickly through the trapping community. Few men with formal scientific education ventured into the wilderness, and Beaumont's knowledge was a valuable resource. Augustin traveled to the trading post specifically to speak with him. He found Beaumont in Levesque's store, examining samples of ore that a prospector had brought in. Augustin introduced himself and asked if Beaumont understood the properties of heat and metal. Beaumont replied that he had studied thermodynamics at university in Lyon and had practical experience with heat management in industrial settings. Augustin explained his problem: a 30-foot cabin, a fireplace at one end, heat that wouldn't travel. Could metal be used to redirect thermal radiation horizontally? Beaumont listened carefully and asked clarifying questions. What was the cabin's interior volume? What type of fireplace? What materials were used in the roof? Augustin answered as precisely as he could. Beaumont considered the problem for several minutes before responding. He explained that heat traveled in three ways: conduction through direct contact, convection through air movement, and radiation through electromagnetic waves. In Augustin's cabin, convection was the primary heat transfer method, and warm air naturally rose, but radiant heat could be reflected by metal surfaces, and if positioned correctly, those reflections could redirect thermal energy. The key, Beaumont explained, was surface area and reflectivity. A small metal sheet would capture and redirect only a small portion of the radiant heat. To meaningfully affect the temperature distribution in a 30-foot cabin, Augustin would need a large reflective surface positioned to intercept rising heat and bounce it outward. Beaumont suggested that a ceiling made of reflective metal might work. The heat rising from the fireplace would strike the metal surface and reflect downward and outward, distributing warmth across the cabin's length. Augustin asked what metal would work best. Beaumont explained that different metals had different reflective properties. Copper had excellent reflectivity for both visible light and thermal radiation. It was also relatively easy to work with, didn't rust, and could be formed into sheets. Silver was superior, but prohibitively expensive. Iron would work, but would corrode and lose effectiveness. Copper was the optimal choice for Augustin's application. Augustin left the conversation with Beaumont, possessed by a vision that seemed simultaneously brilliant and insane. A copper ceiling. Not a small reflective panel, but an entire ceiling surface covering the full interior of his cabin. The concept made theoretical sense based on what Beaumont had explained. Heat rising from the fireplace would strike the copper surface and bounce downward and outward. Instead of concentrating at the ceiling above the fire and dissipating into the roof structure, the thermal radiation would be redirected across the length of the living space. He spent the journey back to his cabin calculating dimensions and material requirements. His cabin interior measured 30 feet long by 12 feet wide. The ceiling area was 360 square feet. But accounting for the sloped roof structure and the optimal positioning Beaumont had described, Augustin estimated he would need approximately 250 to 300 square feet of copper sheet to create an effective reflective surface. The cost was staggering. Copper on the frontier was expensive, valued for its utility in cookware, tools, and ammunition components. Sheet copper was even more costly because it required specialized rolling mills to produce. Augustin estimated that acquiring enough copper for his ceiling would consume every bit of profit from 2 full trapping seasons, possibly 3. It would require selling everything of value he owned and potentially going into debt beyond that. Most men would have abandoned the idea at this point. The investment was too large, the outcome too uncertain. Augustin had no guarantee that the copper ceiling would work, as Beaumont suggested. The metallurgist had provided theoretical support, but he had never seen such a system implemented in a residential structure. Augustin would be gambling his entire financial future on an untested concept driven by grief and obsession. He decided to proceed anyway. The alternative was living in a cabin that had killed his wife, accepting that frontier homes would always have uninhabitable cold zones, abandoning the idea that engineering could solve fundamental survival problems. Augustin refused that acceptance. Celeste had died because his cabin was inadequately designed. If he could build a structure that distributed heat properly, her death would have meaning. It would become the catalyst that improved how people survived in the wilderness. The practical challenges were immense. Acquiring the copper was only the first obstacle. He would need to design a support structure that could hold the weight of metal sheets while allowing for thermal expansion and contraction. He would need to develop a method for joining the sheets to create a continuous reflective surface without significant gaps. He would need to install the system in a way that didn't compromise his roof's structural integrity or weatherproofing. And he would need to accomplish all of this with minimal assistance, limited tools, and no formal training in metalwork or architectural engineering. Augustin began planning in detail. He sketched designs on birch bark and flat stones. He calculated weights and load distributions. He made lists of materials and tools he would need to acquire. By the end of March 1838, he had developed a comprehensive plan. The execution would take months, possibly more than a year. But he was committed. The acquisition of copper became Augustin's singular focus through the spring and summer of 1838. He resumed trapping with intensity, working his lines from dawn until dark, processing pelts with obsessive care to maximize their value. Every beaver pelt, every marten hide, every otter skin represented a fraction of the copper he needed. He stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely essential. His diet reduced to cornmeal, dried beans, and whatever game he could shoot near his cabin. He wore clothes until they were nearly rags before replacing them. By June, he had saved enough to place his first order for copper sheet. The trading post didn't stock such materials, so Levesque arranged for delivery from suppliers in St. Louis. The process would take months. Augustin paid a deposit and waited. While waiting, he continued trapping and began selling personal possessions. He sold Celeste's wedding ring, a decision that felt like betrayal, but which he justified as necessary. She would have understood. The ring brought enough money to purchase another 30 square feet of copper. He sold his spare rifle, keeping only his primary weapon for hunting and defense. He sold extra traps, reducing his trapline capacity, but freeing up capital. He sold tools he could function without. Each transaction was calculated to maximize copper acquisition while maintaining minimum operational capability. Other trappers noticed his selling spree and spread rumors. Some thought he was preparing to leave the territory. Others suspected he had gambling debts. The truth, that he was buying copper for a ceiling, would have seemed even less believable. The first copper shipment arrived in August. 20 sheets, each measuring 2 feet by 3 feet, hammered to approximately 1/16 of an inch thickness. Augustin transported them to his cabin with reverence, handling each sheet carefully to avoid denting or scratching. He stacked them inside, covering them with cloth to protect the surfaces. He now owned 120 square feet of copper. He needed at least 130 more. The fall trapping season was critical. Augustin worked harder than he had in his entire life. He extended his trapline into areas he had previously avoided because of difficult terrain. He took risks checking traps in bad weather. He processed pelts with meticulous attention, ensuring each hide would command premium prices. By November, he had accumulated enough furs to fund another major copper purchase. But frontier commerce was unpredictable. The fur market had softened. Prices in St. Louis had dropped due to oversupply and changing fashion trends in eastern cities. The furs Augustin expected to sell for $300 brought only $220. The shortfall was significant. He compensated by selling more personal items. A pocket watch that had belonged to his father, a compass he had carried since leaving Quebec, books Celeste had treasured. Each sale was painful, but the copper mattered more than sentiment. By December 1838, Augustin had acquired 240 square feet of copper sheet. It had consumed 14 months of income, nearly everything he owned, and left him financially depleted. But he had the material. Now he needed to install it. The structural challenge of installing a copper ceiling consumed Augustin through the winter of 1838 into the spring of 1839. He could not simply nail metal sheets to the existing roof timbers. Copper was heavy, approximately 8 pounds per square foot at the thickness he had acquired. 240 square feet meant nearly 2,000 pounds of metal suspended above his living space. The weight required proper engineering, or the entire system would collapse, potentially killing him in the process. He began by studying his cabin's existing structure. The roof was supported by ridge poles spanning the 12-foot width of the cabin, spaced approximately 3 feet apart. These poles were 8 inches in diameter, strong enough to support the sod roof but not designed for additional weight. Adding a copper ceiling would more than double the load on those supports. Augustin needed to reinforce the framework without rebuilding the entire roof. His solution involved creating a secondary support system suspended from the existing ridge poles. He cut additional poles from dense pine, selecting timber with minimal taper and straight grain. Each support pole was approximately 4 inches in diameter and ran the full 30-foot length of the cabin. He planned to install 6 of these longitudinal supports, spaced 2 feet apart, creating a grid pattern that would distribute the copper's weight evenly. Mounting these longitudinal supports presented technical difficulties. He needed to attach them to the existing ridge poles in a way that transferred weight efficiently while allowing for slight movement as the wood expanded and contracted with temperature and humidity changes. He developed a bracket system using iron straps he forged himself after watching Christopherson work at the trading post. Each bracket wrapped around a ridge pole and supported a longitudinal pole beneath it, with the connection point allowing minimal lateral movement but strong vertical support. Installing the longitudinal supports required working above his head in cramped conditions. He built a temporary scaffolding from small logs and planks, creating a platform that let him reach the ceiling structure. The work was exhausting. Each longitudinal pole weighed over 80 pounds and had to be lifted, positioned, and secured while balanced on scaffolding. He worked alone, using rope and pulley systems he rigged from the ridge poles to help manage the weight. The installation took 3 weeks. When finished, he had a robust framework of 6 longitudinal supports running the length of his cabin, properly braced and capable of holding significant weight. He tested the system by loading it with stones, gradually adding weight until he reached an estimated 2,000 pounds. The framework held without concerning deflection. He removed the test weight and prepared for the next phase. Before installing the copper, Augustin needed to address thermal expansion. Beaumont had warned him that metal expands when heated and contracts when cooled. A rigid installation would buckle and warp as the copper responded to temperature changes from the fireplace below. He needed a mounting system that allowed the copper to expand and contract while maintaining its reflective position and preventing gaps from opening between sheets. He developed a clip system using thin iron strips bent into U-shapes. The clips would hold the copper sheets against the longitudinal supports but allow slight horizontal movement. Each sheet would overlap its neighbor by approximately 1 inch, creating a shingled pattern that would maintain coverage even as individual sheets expanded or contracted. The overlapping design also meant that thermal radiation couldn't escape through gaps between sheets. In April 1839, Augustin began the actual installation of copper sheets. The process immediately attracted attention from neighboring trappers who had heard rumors of his strange construction project but hadn't seen the materials firsthand. Baptiste Fournier was the first to visit, arriving on a spring afternoon to find Augustin on his scaffolding, carefully positioning a copper sheet against the longitudinal supports. Baptiste stood in the doorway watching for several minutes before speaking. He asked what in God's name Augustin was doing. Augustin explained, briefly and without elaborate detail, that he was installing a reflective ceiling to redirect heat from his fireplace across the length of the cabin. Baptiste stared at the copper sheets stacked against the wall, mentally calculating their value. He asked if Augustin understood how much money he had spent on metal that belonged in cooking pots, not on a ceiling. Augustin replied that he understood the cost. Baptiste asked if Augustin had lost his mind with grief over Celeste. The question was blunt, but not entirely unkind. Other trappers had noticed Augustin's obsessive focus and wondered if sorrow had unbalanced him. Augustin answered that grief had focused his mind, not broken it. He was solving a problem that killed his wife and could kill others. Baptiste shook his head, unconvinced, and left without further comment. Word spread through the trapping community with remarkable speed. By the end of April, Augustin's copper ceiling had become a regular topic of conversation at the trading post. The project acquired a nickname that was used with varying degrees of mockery and concern. They called it Mercier's Copper Folly. Some men thought Augustin was wasting resources on a useless extravagance. Others believed he had developed an irrational fixation that had destroyed his judgment. A few wondered if the concept might work, but considered the investment too risky to justify. Lucien Gagnon, a trapper who worked territory adjacent to Augustin's, visited specifically to ridicule the project. He brought 2 other trappers with him, and the 3 men stood in Augustin's cabin making jokes about the copper ceiling. Gagnon said that Augustin had built the most expensive roof in Montana Territory to solve a problem that didn't exist. Everyone knew cabins were cold at the far end. That was simply how cabins worked. You stayed near the fire. You wore warm clothes. You accepted reality instead of spending a fortune trying to change physics. Augustin didn't argue. He continued working while the men talked, positioning copper sheets and securing them with his clip system. His silence seemed to annoy Gagnon more than argument would have. Gagnon asked if Augustin expected the copper to perform magic, to somehow make heat flow sideways against its nature. Augustin replied that heat already flowed in all directions as radiation. He was simply redirecting it. Gagnon laughed and said that Augustin had spent too much time alone in the wilderness, that isolation had made him believe in impossible things. The mockery continued through the spring and into summer, as Augustin methodically installed sheet after sheet of copper. Trappers passing through the area would detour to see the famous folly. Some offered unsolicited advice or criticism, others simply stared and shook their heads. A few asked technical questions that suggested genuine curiosity, but even these men expressed doubt that the system would function as Augustin claimed. The installation of 240 square feet of copper ceiling required precision that tested Augustin's patience and skill. Each sheet measured 2 feet by 3 feet, giving him 40 individual panels to position, secure, and seal. He worked from the fireplace end of the cabin toward the far wall, building the reflective surface progressively across the length of his living space. The first challenge was achieving consistent positioning. Each panel needed to be installed at the same height and angle to create a uniform reflective surface. Variation would create irregular heat distribution and potentially direct thermal radiation into the roof structure instead of down into the living space. Augustin created a measuring system using marked poles and string lines that let him verify the position of each panel before securing it permanently. The copper sheets had arrived flat, but Augustin discovered that installing them flat created a problem. Heat rising from the fireplace would strike a flat ceiling and reflect straight down, creating a hot zone directly above the fire, but not distributing warmth outward. He needed a slight curve to the ceiling surface, subtle enough to maintain structural simplicity, but pronounced enough to redirect thermal radiation at an angle that would carry it across the cabin's length. He solved this by installing the longitudinal supports with a gentle arc, higher at the center of the cabin's width and slightly lower at the walls. The curve was barely perceptible visually, perhaps 4 inches of rise across the 12-foot width, but it was sufficient to create the reflective angle he needed. When copper sheets were mounted to this curved framework, they naturally assumed the same arc, creating a surface that would bounce heat outward and downward rather than straight down. Securing each panel required careful work. He used his iron clips to hold the copper against the longitudinal supports, spacing the clips every 8 inches to prevent sagging. Each clip had to be positioned so it held the copper firmly but didn't create a hard point that would restrict thermal expansion. He learned through trial and error that tightening the clips too much caused the copper to buckle when it heated. Leaving them slightly loose allowed the metal to move fractionally while maintaining its position. The overlapping pattern was critical for maintaining complete coverage. He installed each sheet so its edges overlapped the adjacent sheets by 1 inch. The overlap pattern was carefully planned. Sheets overlapped from the fireplace end toward the far wall, creating a shingled effect that would prevent heat from escaping upward through gaps. The side-to-side overlap followed the same principle, with each row overlapping the row beside it in a consistent pattern. Sealing the overlaps presented another technical challenge. He couldn't use rigid sealants that would prevent the copper from expanding and contracting. He developed a flexible seal using pine resin mixed with a small amount of beeswax. The mixture remained pliable when cool, but wouldn't drip or run when heated. He applied this sealant to the overlap zones, creating a flexible barrier that maintained its seal even as the copper moved with temperature changes. The installation progressed slowly. Augustin averaged 2 panels per day, working carefully to ensure each was properly positioned and secured. Some days he managed 3 panels. Other days, when problems arose or adjustments were needed, he completed only 1. The work required constant attention to detail. A poorly positioned panel would compromise the entire system's effectiveness. On October 3, 1839, Augustin installed the final copper panel. The ceiling was complete. 240 square feet of reflective metal covered the interior of his cabin, creating a surface that caught ambient light and threw it back in shifting patterns. Even without fire, the copper gave the space an unusual quality, making it feel smaller and more contained than before, but also somehow warmer and more protected. Augustin had not lit his fireplace in months, working through the mild autumn weather without heat. Now he needed to test whether 18 months of work and financial sacrifice had produced the result he envisioned. He built a fire using the same moderate amount of wood he would normally burn on a cool evening. Nothing excessive. A standard fire that would provide comfortable warmth near the hearth but would traditionally leave the cabin's far end cold. He lit the kindling and watched the flames grow. Smoke rose into the chimney. Heat began radiating from the firebox, and then something remarkable happened. As the fire established itself and heat rose toward the ceiling, the copper surface began to glow. Not visibly, not like heated metal in a forge, but with a subtle warmth that Augustin could see in how the air shimmered slightly above the reflective surface. He walked to the far end of the cabin and waited. In a traditional cabin, this 30-foot distance from the fireplace would mean standing in noticeably cooler air, but within minutes, Augustin felt warmth reaching him. Not the direct heat of standing near flames, but a gentle, even warmth that seemed to arrive from above and around him simultaneously. He held his hand up toward the copper ceiling. The metal was warm to the touch but not hot. Heat was being absorbed, reflected, and redirected exactly as Beaumont had described. Over the next hour, Augustin monitored the temperature distribution throughout his cabin. He used his water-filled tin cup method, placing identical containers at 5-foot intervals and measuring how quickly they cooled. The results exceeded his expectations. At 30 feet from the fireplace, the cooling rate was only marginally slower than at 5 feet from the fire. The temperature gradient that had killed Celeste had been essentially eliminated. He made adjustments over the following days. He experimented with fire size and discovered that a moderate fire distributed heat more evenly than a large one. Large fires created hot spots directly above the flames. Moderate fires produced thermal radiation that the copper ceiling managed more effectively. He also discovered that the copper's reflectivity improved with polishing. Soot and tarnish accumulated on the surface, reducing its effectiveness. Regular cleaning maintained optimal performance. By mid-October, Augustin had refined his system and confirmed its success. His cabin now distributed heat uniformly across its entire length, using less wood than he had previously burned to heat only the area near the fireplace. The winter of 1839 arrived with typical Montana severity. November brought the first serious cold, temperatures dropping below zero and staying there for days at a time. Augustin faced this winter with confidence that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. His copper ceiling had performed well during autumn's mild tests. Now it would face the conditions that had killed Celeste. He maintained a moderate fire throughout each day, burning approximately half the wood he had consumed during previous winters. The copper ceiling captured the rising heat and reflected it downward and outward with remarkable efficiency. The temperature at the cabin's far end remained only 5 to 6 degrees cooler than the area near the fireplace. In practical terms, this meant the entire cabin was comfortably habitable. He could work at his table 30 feet from the fire without wearing extra layers. He slept in comfort anywhere in the space. The even temperature distribution created secondary benefits he hadn't anticipated. With no extreme temperature gradients, condensation didn't form on the walls. Previous winters had seen frost accumulate on the interior logs at the cabin's cold end, melting during the day and creating dampness that encouraged rot. The copper ceiling eliminated this problem. The entire interior remained dry and at a stable temperature that prevented moisture accumulation. Wood consumption dropped dramatically. Augustin had previously burned through enormous quantities of firewood trying to combat the cold at his cabin's far end. Most of that heat had risen uselessly into the roof structure and dissipated. Now, with the copper ceiling redirecting thermal radiation, every bit of heat from his fire was being used efficiently. He estimated his wood consumption had decreased by half, possibly more. This meant less time cutting and hauling firewood, less exposure to dangerous cold while working outside, and less strain on the surrounding forest. The efficiency became more impressive as winter deepened. December brought temperatures that regularly reached 20 and 30 below zero. Augustin's moderate fires kept his cabin comfortable while neighboring trappers burned massive fires that still left their cabins partially uninhabitable. Baptiste Fournier, living 200 yards away, went through firewood at triple Augustin's rate and still abandoned the far end of his cabin to the cold. In January 1840, a cold snap arrived that tested every structure in the territory. Temperatures dropped to what trappers estimated was 45 below zero and stayed there for 8 consecutive days. This was the same type of weather that had killed Celeste 3 years earlier. Augustin faced it with a moderate fire and complete comfort. His copper ceiling glowed softly in the firelight, reflecting warmth into every corner of his living space. He slept soundly, worked normally, and used approximately 1/3 the firewood that neighboring cabins consumed. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Trappers passing Augustin's cabin noticed the modest smoke from his chimney and wondered how he survived. Some assumed he had left the territory. Others thought he had moved to the trading post for winter. Those who visited found him comfortable and warm in conditions that were creating desperate circumstances elsewhere. By February 1840, Augustin noticed a subtle decrease in his ceiling's effectiveness. The temperature at the cabin's far end was dropping from 5 or 6 degrees below the fireplace area to 8 or 9 degrees below. Still far better than a traditional cabin, but a measurable change that concerned him. He examined the copper surface carefully and identified the problem. Soot and tarnish had accumulated over 4 months of continuous use. The copper's reflective properties depended on surface cleanliness. A shiny, clean surface reflected thermal radiation efficiently. A dirty, tarnished surface absorbed more heat than it reflected, reducing the system's effectiveness. Augustin realized that maintaining his ceiling would require regular cleaning, a task he hadn't fully considered during the design phase. He experimented with cleaning methods. Water alone removed soot, but didn't address tarnish. He tried various substances available to him, A mixture of wood ash and water created a mild abrasive that removed tarnish but required significant scrubbing. He discovered that a paste made from fine sand, vinegar, and salt worked remarkably well. The acid in the vinegar dissolved tarnish, while the sand provided gentle abrasive action. Applied with cloth and rubbed in circular patterns, the mixture restored the copper's reflectivity. The cleaning process was labor-intensive. He had to work on scaffolding again, reaching overhead to scrub 240 square feet of metal surface. His arms ached from the repetitive motion. The work took 3 full days, but the results justified the effort. After cleaning, the copper gleamed like new metal. The temperature distribution returned to optimal levels. The far end of his cabin warmed back to within 5 degrees of the fireplace area. Augustin established a maintenance schedule based on this experience. He would clean the entire ceiling every 2 months during heavy use periods and every 3 months during milder weather when fires burned less frequently. The schedule required discipline but was manageable. 3 or 4 days of work every few months to maintain a system that had transformed his survival seemed like a reasonable trade. He also developed techniques to reduce soot accumulation. Burning well-seasoned hardwood produced less soot than green wood or softwoods. Maintaining proper airflow in the fireplace created cleaner combustion. Avoiding the practice of damping down fires overnight, which caused incomplete burning and heavy soot production, kept the copper cleaner. These practices extended the time between required cleanings and improved overall system performance. The maintenance requirement became part of Augustin's routine. He accepted it as the price of having a cabin that distributed heat evenly and efficiently. Other trappers might mock the effort required, but those trappers were freezing in poorly heated cabins while Augustin lived in comfort. The winter of 1840 to 1841 became legendary in Montana Territory. Trappers who survived it would reference that winter for decades as the standard against which all cold weather was measured. The season began early, with heavy snow in October, and intensified through November into conditions that killed livestock, froze rivers solid to unprecedented depths, and tested every structure and survival strategy in the territory. January 1841 brought temperatures that older trappers claimed were the coldest they had experienced in 30 years on the frontier. The cold was absolute and unrelenting. It settled over the land like a physical presence, turning breath to ice crystals instantly, freezing exposed skin in minutes, making metal tools painful to touch even through gloves. Trappers abandoned their lines. Travel became nearly impossible. Survival reduced to staying inside and keeping fires burning. Baptiste Fournier's cabin, 200 yards from Augustin's, became a desperate place. Baptiste had built his structure using traditional methods 5 years earlier. It was adequate for normal winters, but completely inadequate for the conditions of January 1841. He burned fires constantly, massive fires that consumed wood faster than he could process it. Despite these efforts, frost formed on his interior walls. The far end of his cabin, where his children normally slept, became uninhabitable. The family crowded onto pallets dragged within 5 feet of the fireplace, huddled together for warmth. On January 12th, Baptiste's wife Marie woke him in the middle of the night. Their youngest child, a daughter of 4 years, was shaking uncontrollably despite being wrapped in furs and pressed between her parents near the fire. The child's skin was cold to the touch. Marie was terrified. They had heard stories of Celeste Mercier's death 4 years earlier under similar circumstances. Marie insisted they needed help. Baptiste dressed in every layer he owned and went outside into cold that stole his breath. He made his way to Augustin's cabin through darkness and wind that cut like knives. He pounded on Augustin's door, desperate and ashamed in equal measure. He had mocked Augustin's copper ceiling mercilessly. He had called it a folly and waste. Now he was begging for the help that folly might provide. Augustin opened his door. Warmth poured out into the frozen night. Baptiste explained the situation in rushed, frightened words. His daughter was dangerously cold despite their fire. Could Augustin help? Augustin didn't hesitate. He told Baptiste to bring his entire family to his cabin immediately. Baptiste asked if Augustin was certain if there was room. Augustin said there was warmth, which was what mattered. Baptiste returned to his cabin and gathered Marie and their 3 children. They wrapped themselves in every blanket and fur they owned and made the 200-yard journey through brutal cold. Augustin met them at his door and brought them inside. The contrast was immediate and overwhelming. Baptiste's cabin had been desperately cold despite its roaring fire. Augustin's cabin was genuinely warm throughout its entire space. Marie Mercier and her children stood inside Augustin's cabin, their breath still visible from the cold they had brought in with them, but already the warmth was reaching them. The youngest child, still shaking, was carried to the far end of the cabin, 30 feet from the fireplace, and placed on furs. Within minutes, the shaking began to subside. Within 20 minutes, the child's skin felt warm again. Marie wept with relief. Baptiste stood near the door, looking around Augustin's cabin with new comprehension. The fire burning in the hearth was moderate, nothing like the massive blaze he had been maintaining in his own fireplace. Yet the temperature throughout this space was comfortable, even warm. He walked slowly toward the far end where his family was settling, feeling for the temperature drop he expected. It barely existed. At 30 feet from the fire, the air was only slightly cooler than near the hearth. He looked up at the copper ceiling. The metal surface caught the firelight and seemed to glow softly. He could feel warmth radiating downward from it, gentle but persistent. The entire cabin felt enveloped in even heat, as though the warmth was coming from all directions simultaneously rather than from a single-point source. It was unlike anything he had experienced in a frontier cabin. Augustin made coffee and served it to his guests. Baptiste asked, finally, how the ceiling worked. Augustin explained the principles as Beaumont had taught him. Heat rises as radiation. Metal reflects that radiation. A properly positioned reflective surface redirects heat downward and outward instead of letting it escape into the roof structure. The copper ceiling captured thermal energy from the fire and distributed it across the cabin's entire length. Baptiste asked about the cost. Augustin told him honestly. 2 years of trapping income, everything of value he had owned, months of labor. Baptiste was quiet for a moment, then said that if it meant his children survived winters like this one, the cost was justified. He asked if Augustin would help him build a similar ceiling. Augustin agreed immediately. The Fournier family stayed in Augustin's cabin for 3 days, while the worst of the cold snap passed. During that time, Baptiste observed every detail of the copper ceiling's construction. He asked questions about the support framework, the clip system, the overlapping panel arrangement, the maintenance requirements. Augustin answered everything completely. He had no interest in keeping the technique secret. If his innovation could prevent other families from experiencing what he had suffered, that was its purpose. When the temperature moderated enough for travel, Baptiste and his family returned to their own cabin. But Baptiste had already decided. He would acquire copper and build a reflective ceiling. The investment was substantial, but the alternative was unacceptable. He had nearly lost his daughter to cold that Augustin's cabin defeated easily. The copper folly that Baptiste had mocked so thoroughly had proven itself in the most definitive way possible. It had saved his child's life. Spring 1841 brought a transformation in how the trapping community viewed Augustin's copper ceiling. Baptiste Fournier told his story at the trading post, explaining how his family had nearly frozen in their own cabin while Augustin's remained warm. Other trappers who had survived the brutal winter in desperate conditions listened with new interest. The mockery that had greeted Augustin's project 2 years earlier shifted to serious questions about implementation. Lucien Gagnon, who had been among the most vocal critics of the copper folly, approached Augustin in late March. He asked, without his previous contempt, whether the ceiling really worked as Baptiste claimed. Augustin invited him to visit and see for himself. Gagnon spent an afternoon examining the installation, asking technical questions, calculating costs. He left convinced but daunted by the investment required. By summer, 3 trappers had begun acquiring copper for their own sealing projects. None had Augustine's resources or determination, so their plans were more modest. One man intended to install copper over only half his cabin, creating a warm zone rather than heating the entire space. Another planned to use thinner copper sheets to reduce costs, accepting potentially reduced effectiveness. The third was forming a partnership with 2 other trappers to share costs and labor. Augustin provided advice freely. He explained the importance of the support framework, the necessity of allowing thermal expansion, the maintenance requirements. He warned against shortcuts that would compromise effectiveness. Some men listened carefully. Others proceeded with modified designs that Augustin suspected would underperform. But even imperfect implementations of the principle would improve heat distribution compared to traditional cabin construction. The trading post owner, Levesque, recognized a business opportunity. He began stocking copper sheets, pricing them to encourage sales while maintaining profit margins. The availability of copper locally eliminated the months-long wait for shipments from St. Louis and made projects more feasible. By autumn 1841, 5 cabins in the territory were under construction or modification to include reflective copper ceilings. The technique acquired variations as different builders adapted it to their circumstances. Some used tin instead of copper, accepting lower reflectivity in exchange for significant cost savings. Others installed reflective ceilings over only portions of their cabins, focusing on sleeping areas or workspaces. A few wealthy traders invested in complete installations matching Augustin's design. The common thread was recognition that reflective ceilings solved a fundamental problem of frontier housing. Word spread beyond the immediate trapping community. A military surveying party passing through the territory in summer 1842 heard about the copper ceilings and investigated. Their report mentioned the innovation as an example of frontier adaptation to extreme conditions. A newspaper correspondent traveling west included a brief description in an article about Montana Territory. The knowledge was escaping its isolated origin and entering broader circulation. By 1843, the year Baptiste Fournier stood in Augustin's warm cabin during a blizzard, reflective ceilings had ceased being an oddity. They were becoming an established technique, one option among many for frontier construction, recognized as effective but requiring investment that not everyone could afford. Augustin Mercier never promoted his copper ceiling innovation beyond answering questions from those who sought him out. He returned to trapping in 1842, working his lines with the same methodical care he had applied to building his reflective ceiling. The difference was that he now returned each evening to a cabin that provided genuine comfort regardless of outside temperatures. His quality of life had improved dramatically, but he took no particular pride in having created something that was changing frontier construction. The innovation spread through organic adoption rather than organized promotion. Trappers who built copper ceilings showed them to visitors. Those visitors carried the knowledge to other territories. Trading post operators stocked copper sheets because demand existed. Builders experimented with variations, some successful and others less so, but the core principle remained constant. Metal surfaces positioned to redirect rising heat created more evenly heated interior spaces. By 1845, variations of Mercier's ceiling had appeared in structures throughout the northern Rocky Mountain territories. The name Mercier ceiling was used occasionally, but more often people simply referred to copper ceilings or reflective ceilings without attributing the innovation to any specific individual. Augustin preferred this anonymity. He had built his ceiling to solve a personal problem, not to achieve recognition or profit. The fur trade continued its collapse through the 1840s. Beaver populations had been depleted in accessible areas, and fashion trends had shifted away from felt hats made from beaver pelts. Trappers left the mountains in increasing numbers, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Augustin remained until 1846, longer than many, but eventually he too recognized that the era was ending. He sold his cabin and trapline to a younger man arriving from Ohio. The sale included detailed instructions for maintaining the copper ceiling and explanations of how the system functioned. Augustin departed for Oregon Territory with modest savings and memories of a life lived in extreme conditions. He had survived when many had not, partly through skill and partly through his willingness to question accepted methods. In Oregon, Augustin established a small ranch near the Willamette Valley. He married in 1847 a widow named Catherine, who had lost her husband on the overland trail. They built a modest home, raised cattle and horses, and lived quietly. Augustin never mentioned his copper ceiling innovation unless directly asked about his years in the mountains. It was a chapter of his life that had closed. The cabins he had influenced remained scattered across Montana and Wyoming territories, occupied by new inhabitants who often didn't know the history of their structures. They simply appreciated that their homes stayed warmer with less firewood than traditional cabins required. The innovation had become invisible, integrated into frontier building practices without fanfare or recognition. Augustin Mercier died on March 14, 1868, at age 53, on his Oregon ranch. He was buried in a small cemetery outside the settlement of Champoeg. His gravestone noted his years of birth and death and identified him as a rancher and former trapper. There was no mention of copper ceilings or innovations in heat distribution. To those who attended his funeral, he was simply a quiet man who had lived a productive life and left behind a widow and 2 stepchildren. But in the mountains of Montana and Wyoming, structures built using principles Augustin had developed continued to function decades after his death. Some of the original copper ceilings remained in place, maintained by occupants who recognized their value. Others had been modified or replaced, but the knowledge of reflective heat distribution had become embedded in frontier construction practices. Builders who had never heard of Augustin Mercier nevertheless used techniques he had pioneered. The broader impact of his innovation is difficult to quantify precisely. Frontier record-keeping was sporadic, and many lives saved by better heated cabins went undocumented. But accounts from the period reference improved winter survival rates in areas where reflective ceilings became common. Fewer families abandoned cabins due to inadequate heating. Fewer children died from cold-related illnesses. Wood consumption decreased, reducing the labor burden on isolated families and lessening environmental impact on surrounding forests. The principle that Augustin had demonstrated transcended the specific application of copper ceilings. He had proven that frontier survival wasn't only about physical toughness or martial prowess. Engineering and thoughtful problem-solving could eliminate dangers before they became crises. A well-designed cabin meant not having to fight against winter cold with brute force and endless firewood. It meant creating an environment where survival became routine rather than heroic. This philosophy influenced later frontier development. When homesteaders arrived under the Homestead Act, some built with attention to heat distribution principles that traced back to innovations like Augustin's. Military outposts constructed in remote territories incorporated reflective surfaces in their most critical buildings. Trading posts and way stations used similar techniques. The thread connecting these developments to Augustin's original cabin was indirect but real. The story of Augustin Mercier's copper ceiling illustrates how innovation often emerges from necessity rather than abstract theorizing. He wasn't trying to revolutionize architecture. He was trying to prevent another death like Celeste's. The solution he developed required no new technology, only existing materials applied with exceptional care and intelligence, informed by scientific principles. His legacy wasn't carved in monuments or recorded in history books. It was built into structures that sheltered people from deadly cold, expressed in the lives that continued because cabins distributed heat effectively, embedded in the quiet knowledge that good engineering solves problems that strength and courage cannot. Augustin Mercier proved that understanding physics and applying it methodically could accomplish what the frontier had previously considered impossible, leaving behind not fame, but warmth.